About the vaccine rage on, a new element has come to the fore. Employers are now in a position where they will have to decide on a mandatory vaccination policy in the workplace. But what would this policy look like, and how would it affect its employees, particularly those who would argue that it's their right to refuse to get vaccinated? Joining me now to discuss this further is Professor Hugo Pienaar, who's the Director of Employment Practice at Cliff Decker Hofmeyer. Prof, many thanks for your time this evening. Now, as it stands, do we have any law in South Africa that would make it mandatory for companies to establish such a policy in the workplace?
Well, thank you for having me. And your first question is right to the point. Of course, there's no direct legislation imposing that duty on employer or on employees to have such a piece of legislation or policy in place. What is, however, relevant, and I've just made for your consideration 10 legal principles that may come into play, and some of those may be of conflicting nature or not. And let me just briefly touch on that, given our limited time. Well, the first is, of course, the occupational health and safety legislation in South Africa, and that imposes a duty on employers to provide its employees with a safe working environment. What is interesting about that, it also places a duty to provide such safe working environment for subcontractors. In other words, not its own employees, that will work sometimes shoulder to shoulder to its own employees. So there's health and safety legislation. Second question, if there's an instruction or a policy to that effect, what is the test? Always is the reasonable and a lawful instruction, and then comes into play some of the other factors. Another duty, of course, on employees, not to willfully endanger the safety of fellow employees, which in terms of Schedule 8 of the Act may result into a dismissal of an employee. So those are the first three. The fourth one is, of course, simple operational requirements of the employer, which sound legal principles to have not only a safe working environment, but to provide for some form of job security. Now, if we take where employers come from, and you have an outbreak of COVID at the workplace, that places may close down the company and ultimately affect the job security of employees. So that's another principle that may come into. The other point that you've raised right at the outset correctly so is the right of the individual. And of course there's the right to security of person and body, there's a right to freedom of religion, there's cultural differences, and all of those will come into play, including the employee's personal medical circumstances, which may justify a refusal to take a vaccine under certain circumstances. There's the POPI Act, because you must manage the personal information of that employee once you embark on that process. There's the seventh one, that's about company liability. Let's say you impose this policy and there are consequences of this, with the vaccine having some sort of adverse impact. How will that impact on the employee's risk of liability? There's another interesting legal principle that may come into play. Section 23 of the Labour Relations Act allows employers, for instance, to enter into an agreement, a collective agreement with a majority trade union or trade unions at the workplace to impose certain agreements or conditions of employment. And the question is whether that's a possibility, that you enter into agreement with a majority trade union to impose that, and of course that then becomes part of the conditions of employment. But of course it's not that simple. The other point that I've raised earlier is the issue of subcontractors. I have some employees coming to my workplace. We know in the mining environment, before people, by way of example, before people may come into your premises, everybody is tested for alcohol or drugs. Now the same here. To what extent can you implement that policy, or say that that your subcontractors and their employees must also comply with that? Of course, that falls outside the scope of your question. Another interesting point, and that's the last one, which I thought is useful to consider, if the employer imposes it, the question may ultimately be, does that constitute a unilateral change of conditions of employment? Which that may cause the unions to invoke certain rights in terms of Section 64 of the Labour Relations Act. So ultimately, difficult question, conflicting principles. Ideally, if you want to impose, you will consult, you try and get the buy-in. That's always the first price. But ultimately, consider all of those. No right is absolute, not the right of the individual and not the right of the employer. And we know Section 36 of the Constitution says this is a balancing act. And my sense is that the Constitutional Court will potentially have the final say on this very complex topic.
Very complex indeed, Prof. And I just want to say, well, while we go through all these contradictory points that are at play here when it comes to taking the vaccine in the workplace, ultimately at the moment it's the prerogative of the employer to decide whether it is they would like to create such a policy. And so I wonder the kind of pressure that would have to be put on an employee. How is the employee protected in this regard if an employer decides that this is the way that we're going to go when it comes to the vaccine, because we want to protect all the employers that work for us at the company, and this is the way to do it?
Isn't it again the question about the collective or the individual? But ultimately, the defense of the employee could potentially be relying on those three constitutional points, whether it's the Section 12, integrity of person and body, freedom of religion or cultural issues, or its personal, or that employee's personal circumstances, and in that showing that the instruction was not reasonable. But of course, in showing that, other role players' rights will come into play. But those would be the typical sort of rights that employees may endeavor to exercise, and including the right to say that this is a unilateral change of my conditions of employment. You may not invoke that unilaterally on me. My sense is that the employer's prerogative, given the overall duty to provide a safe working environment, will be potentially the most important factor to consider.
Yeah, Prof, unfortunately we've run out of time there. It would have been very interesting to know what international practice is at the moment in the workplace and what South Africa could learn from other companies across the world. But of course it's a conversation we'll continue to have over the coming weeks as we wait for those doses to come into South Africa. That is Professor Hugo Pienaar, who's the Director of Employment Practice at Cliff Decker Hofmeyr. With that, a quick look at how your markets ended off the day. The